At the start of Honkai Star Rail, the first event banner to release featured Seele, a familiar face in the Honkai universe no doubt. She was a welcome choice too. During the first couple months of a gacha game, everyone's top priority is to assemble a team that can carry them through as much of the early to mid game as possible before branching out and adding more units to their roster. But with there being no established formula or benchmark for Star Rail as it only just came out, the most practical choice would be to focus on whoever the spotlight was shining on, and in this case, it was a very sound gamble to make. Seele quickly established herself as the frontrunner in the damage-dealing department, easily outclassing her fellow Day 1 cast members. Combined with her significant involvement in the Eurilla 6 questline and her heavily shipped pairing with Bronya, Seele proved to be very effective in combat, cementing herself as the best DPS unit in the game by far. Now that a full year has passed, has she managed to withstand the test of time, or have the changes in the metagame compounded by emerging competition pushed her out of relevance? Let's find out what happened to Seele. When comparing her to alternative choices we had for version 1.0, it's no surprise why she was the best damage dealer in the game. If you didn't use her, your other options were Qingchui, Clara, Serval, Himeko, Herda, Danheng, Susheng, Yanqing, Arlen, and Took. Looking at these units, you can make an argument nowadays that some of them might be better in certain scenarios, and you're not wrong. But considering at the beginning of Star Rail with everyone's main concern being just to get through the game, Seele had the right set of tools to get you through the early to mid stages of progression. Her turn reset capabilities made her surprisingly competent against mid quantities of enemies, which just so happened to comprise the majority of content at the time. Story mode skirmishes would usually only have 2 or 3 enemies at most, while Calyxes either had the same formation or typically one-shottable fodder. Furthermore, what made her stand out was how simple and straightforward she was as a character, thus making her very consistent too. Lack of consistency can be detrimental to a unit's performance as it can result in them feeling underwhelming more often than not, even if their maximum ceiling is a lot higher. For instance, comparing Seele to Clara, while Svarog's Pride and Joy technically had a higher DPS ceiling, meeting the requirements of this was easier said than done, as Clara was dependent on getting attacked repeatedly to initiate her counter. Qingchui was another unit with immense damage potential, a point that is emphatically and annoyingly stressed by proponents of her. When getting matching tiles, not only does she get an empowered basic attack, but she gains incredibly high damage and attack buffs to go along with it. The one caveat is that doing so necessitates that you relinquish all the good fortune fate is willing to give you throughout your lifetime. Simply put, the rest of the competition couldn't hold a candle to Seele's remarkable baseline. Anyone with comparable damage output as her suffered from consistency issues like Yanqing, while more stable options like Danheng were just inferior due to a lower stat line, resulting in Seele taking a definitive role as the game's best damage dealer. She managed to hold on to that title for quite some time, as following her was our beloved General Jingyuan. While a strong contender in its own right, Seele's ability to sweep through enemies whether in numbers or isolation was second to none, benefiting from direct enhancements to speed much more compared to Jingyuan, whose follow-up attack from Lightning Lord couldn't be accelerated via turn advancements from units like Bronya. Overall, Jingyuan was a worthwhile character, but Erudition ran into issues with viable use cases early on in the game's timeline. Throughout most of version 1, Hoyo's primary goal was to flesh out the roster, making characters for every possible combat scenario one can think of. Luocha for sustain, Silver Wolf for debuffing, Kafka for damage over time, Pushuan for cover tanking, and so on. With respect to regular DPS units though, the first 3 noteworthy ones to come out were the infamous Destruction Trio, Blade, Lunai Danheng, and Jingliu, giving rise to the short-lived albeit influential Destruction meta spanning versions 1.2 through 1.5, before the release of Pure Fiction. The advantages offered by them, namely their high damage output in tandem with area coverage, may have initially appeared to be the point where Seele met her match, as conceptually Seele is single-target oriented. Their inclusion certainly put a blemish on her near immaculate ledger up until that point, but unlike other Hun units like Yanqing, as I mentioned before, Seele could fairly competently handle groups of 2 to 3 enemies or bosses who could spawn minions on the side, as she can make quick work of the small fry without losing too much uptime on the actual boss, if any at all. Proper management of resurgence would give her damage scaling on par with some of the game's best, an aspect of her that held fast for a lot longer than many have expected. As such, she remained a serviceable contender within the cast. Things began taking a turn for the worse though, when the dynamic of Star Rail showed signs of transformation towards the tail end of 2023. Version 1.5 oversaw the release of Argenti, a premier member of the Erudition pack, and in the version after, Pure Fiction was released, creating another endgame mode that offered the same level of challenge as MOC, but with a twist. Instead of clearing a predetermined set of enemies, the goal was to sweep your way through hordes of endlessly spawning mooks, trying to get rid of as many as possible within a fixed amount of time. One would assume, despite being a Hun character, Seele's unique reset mechanic would ever excel in this department. Historically, many have taken advantage of her faculty in one-shotting weaker enemies to great effect, chiefly in Golden Calyxes and story mode quests, but Pure Fiction was another beast entirely. Seele's reset mechanic, when paired in tandem with just Bronya, enables her to effectively act up to 6 times in a single turn. Attack, reset, ultimate, reset, Bronya skill to then attack and reset again. Assuming each action one-shots an enemy, Seele can wipe out 6 targets in one cycle. Not too bad for a unit belonging to a path reserved for single target damage. But therein lies the problem. Seele is first and foremost a hunt character. She can deal with multiple enemies, but she's not designed to. I kept bringing up that she was actually good against small groups of enemies, no more than 2 or 3, because she can destroy the fodder and get right back into killing her main target. Pure Fiction, however, isn't about clear speed, not entirely at least. It's a test of endurance. By now it's common knowledge that using Seele for AoE clearing can be very taxing on one's SP. Assuming you make use of her skill every action, a single turn can drain up to 5 SP from just her alone, making her unsustainable in Pure Fiction. She works in Calyxes because there's only a total of like 8 mobs before the run resets, but in Pure Fiction, you're expected to clear dozens upon dozens of enemies in one sitting. Simply put, Seele can frontload very well, but she can't survive long stretches of AoE combat unless you have SP positive units on your team like Sparkle. The advantage of other DPS paths is that they can target clusters of enemies and continuously do so without running out of steam, naturally making them better options in this department. So, you might be asking, why am I making a big deal out of this when I myself mentioned that Seele is understandably not intended to be used in Pure Fiction? I did so merely to highlight that what originally made her stand out from the cast is now the very thing that's holding her back in this increasingly competitive environment. For all the damage our favorite Wildfire member can do, for better or worse, Seele is a very simple character. Compared to all the other DPS units, she is arguably the most straightforward 5-star damage dealer in the game, subsequently resulting in a strong early to mid game. Her current situation is almost identical to that one bell curve meme. I'm sure you guys have seen it before, where there's a bell curve with a bottom IQ score guy saying something, and then the guy in the middle is complaining about something contrary to the bottom IQ guy, and then the guy with the upper IQ says the exact same thing as the bottom IQ guy. That's the best way I can summarize how things are with Seele right now. Her win condition is to attack as many times as possible while in her empowered state, as doing so results in 80% bonus damage on everything. The problem is, maximizing her DPS against a truly isolated single target is ironically impossible under normal circumstances. The idea behind Seele's resurgence is that in exchange for quote-unquote wasting a turn trying to kill a minion or side enemy, she can make up for that lost turn by refreshing her action and dealing heavy damage to her priority target. But if you're facing just one enemy, the only way for you to access resurgence is to activate her ultimate, amplifying the strength of the ultimate attack and then the following action. From then on, you have to wait until her ultimate comes back up before you can get it again. Conveniently, most if not all bosses can spawn a minion or 2, giving you plenty of opportunities to use her talent, assuming you can clear those mooks very quickly. If you can't, her DPS falls off a cliff, but if you can, she has one of the highest ceilings in the game. How this works against her is that it makes her come off a lot weaker or less practical when evaluated against other options. Her internal moveset is very consistent, but external factors can render her inconsistent. You were able to overlook all this early on as Blade wasn't setting new records, while Lunai Danheng shared the same challenge of an exorbitantly high investment ceiling. By 1.4, however, is when the meta started to catch up to her with the release of Jingliu. What made Jingliu stand out from other Destruction 5 stars is how easy she was, or rather is, to get going. The vast amount of damage bonuses within her repertoire and their ease of access made her by far the best DPS unit in the game, as her ceiling was simultaneously very high and consistent to reach, not restricted by enemy formation or your own team. She's a fully self-contained unit. Even by this point, Seele's theoretical damage ceiling was still higher, but when averaging everything out, it was lower. Think of it like this, Seele's pressure range is 80 to 120. When everything goes right, she can be extremely strong, but it's compensated by her DPS being underwhelming when things don't go right, averaging her out at 100. Jingliu, on the other hand, has a pressure range of 100 to 110, averaging out at 105. She may not climb quite as high as the likes of Lunai Danheng or Seele, but her average is just better. Applicably speaking, Jingliu was a more practical option than Seele in that regard, demanding far less out of the player while still obtaining better results. This continued to happen in version 1.6 of the release of Dr. Ratio, a fellow hunt unit with the ability to also attack multiple times per cycle, just in a different way. Ratio's ultimate allowed his allies to trigger his own follow-up attack, essentially serving as his own version of Resurgence. Unlike Seele, however, Ratio could still pull this off against a singular enemy, causing him to eclipse her in 1v1 damage. Her saving grace is that she still had the upper hand when fighting more than one enemy, as Ratio is, for all intents and purposes, hopelessly ineffective if there are 3 or more enemies to contend with. This is where things get complicated though. Version 2 oversaw the release of Black Swan and Sparkle, the latter of which not only sharing the same element as Seele, but also having a kit that almost looks like it was intended for these SP costly hyper carries like her and Lunai Danheng. At the same time, the advent of Black Swan created one of the most powerful teams in the game, one that can make easy work of both MLC and Pure Fiction. Caucus 1 excelled in equal parts consistency and effectiveness, elevating the ceiling of damage and clearing to heights never seen before. They could basically dish out the same damage to all targets without having to think, whereas Seele can only do something like this with extreme investment, a carefully formulated party, and ideally quantum-weak enemies. What's been occurring for the past two versions is that even though Seele's highs are still some of the best in the game, more and more units come out with better lows, giving them better average performances than her, which is ultimately what matters more than a theoretical max, especially one that cannot be consistently reached. You may have noticed that ever since version 2, the health pools of every MOC and Pure Fiction have jumped up significantly. Seele was actually not half bad in Pure Fiction when it first came out, as enemies were so weak she could one-shot them even with basic attacks. But HP scaling is reaching a point where scoring resets is becoming less tenable, greatly undermining her usability in both fronts. And I have reason to believe it will only get more onerous from here. Then again, considering Robin's a Harmony unit, who knows, maybe optimistically she might throw a bone at Seele. We'll have to wait and see. On the subject of supports, more and more have come out that drastically elevated the strength of many other units. Sparkle did buff Seele, but she also buffed Lunai Danheng, the only one prior to version 2.1 with a higher maximum than Seele. Ranmei was a welcome addition for Kafka, Blade, and Jingliu teams, pushing up their applicable strength as well. The meta has caught up very quickly. No longer was Seele's damage potential the exception, it has now become the rule. This has put Seele in a very uncomfortable limbo state where she's able to handle multiple situations but doesn't excel at any of them. Against one enemy, Ratio is more appropriately equipped for those scenarios, and in wave battles like Pure Fiction, Himeko, Argenti, Jingyuan, and Herda are likewise more appropriate to handle those. Were it just that, things would still be within manageable limits for Seele. It's not that she got weaker, far from it, she too has improved in strength and consistency with supports who could facilitate her a bit more, and her Mono Quantum team is still proving to be one of the most effective endgame squads, as now you can guarantee that Silver Wolf will get quantum weakness on his skill. But the gap between Seele and everyone else has effectively been close to version 2.0 and then exceeded in version 2.1. Enter Akron, the better Seele. Nah, I'm just kidding. They do look very similar though, don't they? In all seriousness, it would be no exaggeration to say that Acheron blatantly power creeped the DPS role. She has everything and then some. Weakness bypass, exponential damage amplification, hypercarry support compatibility, single target DPS, wave clearing. She single-handedly broke the meta. In Seele's defense, it's not like she was particularly affected by Acheron's release any worse than others. Everyone got power crept. The important thing to consider though is that Seele's last hope for dominance in the meta was her phenomenal damage ceiling, difficult to achieve as it is. Calling back to that bell curve meme I was referring to, if you dedicated yourself to pushing Seele to her absolute limits, then yes, you could get past the mid-level and go back to her just ass-whooping everyone. While players in the mid-level like you were using Ratio, Jingliu, or Lunai Danheng because they were more comfy, the sweaty gamers got to enjoy Seele once again. But with Akron in the picture, things just got a whole lot worse. If Seele's range is 80 to 120, Akron's is more like 100 to 140, a direct upgrade in virtually every circumstance. I really hope that Akron is like the Nicoletta Starro, where she's a one-off release and they're not going to use her as a new benchmark for damage units. As it currently stands, Seele's in a very tough spot. She hasn't fallen off in the sense that she's unusable, but for the average player, incentives to use other characters are far greater in number, as they're less inconsistent or cover a lot more. Personally speaking, I've basically discontinued usage of Seele in favor of others, despite having a fairly decked out one if I do say so myself. A major roadblock that prevents her from seeing a resurgence in the meta is that she's too straightforward. Other carries can receive improvements through supports and such that increase their unique mechanics, such as Topaz boosting Ratio and Jingyuan's follow-up attacks, or units who can support damage over time. Even if we make a case that supports who can battery ultimates or increase ultimate damage will be helpful to Seele, they will be also helpful to Jingliu and Acheron in getting stronger ultimates, they'll be helpful to Ratio in getting more follow-up attacks, and Lunai Danheng in getting more fake SP to use, so it's hard to make a support unit that specializes in buffing Seele more than everyone else, not unless they have something very specific like doubles the damage of teammates or reset mechanics. In totality, she's still a good character, but the competition accelerated very quickly to match and eventually surpass her. I don't see her ever completely falling off, in light of her designation as a hypercarry naturally helping her out in min-maxing situations, but I wonder, how long is she gonna hold out for? What do you guys think? Do you believe Seele has fallen off, or do you think she's still one of the best? I welcome you to share in the comments. For now, if you enjoyed the video, it would be great if you could leave a like and subscribe. Don't forget to follow my Twitter @Varsvarm, join my Discord server, and check out my episode on what happened to Welt if you haven't yet. But till next time, thanks so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care.